Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. It's hard to believe that fall is already here. I hope that you had a chance to enjoy summer in whatever way you could. There are, of course, many activities that you could enjoy in the fall as well, but around here, we're mainly looking forward to all new seasons of a bunch of Trek shows. Lower Decks is getting ready to wrap up its second season. We've got the all-new Star Trek Prodigy dropping on October 28th, Discovery Season 4 beginning on November 18th, Picard Season 2 launching in February of next year, and Strange New Worlds bowing sometime after that. This is it. This is the golden age of Star Trek, and we at Enterprising Individuals have not been idle. Every Thursday night, we host a live podcast called Discoverage, where we talk about the newest episode of Trek, be it Lower Decks, Prodigy, Disco, and more. You can join us at 8 p.m. Central when we go live to talk about the episode. Follow us at EISTPOD on Twitter to get the link when we go live, and we'll be discussing the new episode. You can tweet to us during the show using the hashtag Discoverage to join our conversation. New Star Trek and new Discoverage Thursdays this fall. Way back in February of this year, Darren Mooney of The Escapist was on the show to talk about the immunity syndrome. And in the course of our discussion of that second season TOS episode, Darren proffered the theory that the third season of TOS, its last beleaguered season, was oddly obsessed with the ideas of death and disease and decay. Every other episode, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are beaming down to barren and deadly planets. Pathogens and poisons figure large in many stories. Kirk literally loses a child, and nearly everyone gets a girlfriend, but has to leave them behind. Or they get possessed by space ghosts, and we never see them again. I am fascinated by the idea that the third season of TOS is more than just the bad one. And so last week I had Darren back on the show to discuss a third season episode about a ghost planet, that which survives, and also the general themes present in season 3. Last time Darren was on the show, we talked so much about non-Star Trek media that I was able to cut together a completely separate episode of our discussion. And this time around, well, you've heard the saying, Mooney talks. And I've got another entirely supplemental episode containing our extended discussions of recent pop culture topics. In addition to talking about the third season of TOS, we also managed to hit the recent release of Shang Chi, the completion of the Evangelion rebuild series with the release of its final film, 3.0 plus 1.0, the current war between cinemas and home streaming, the future of the Doctor Who franchise, and we also take a hard look at the future of Star Trek and what Trek should be about in the new millennium. I should note that our speculation in our conversation on who might take over as the showrunner and head writer of Doctor Who, that talk happened before the announcement that Russell T Davies would be returning to the show. And it was before it was announced that J. Michael Straczynski would be rebooting Babylon 5, for what that's worth. All of these outtakes we present for you today in digest form, and if you enjoy non-Trek talk, you can hear outtakes from just about all of my conversations with guests about pop culture topics. We call it Live Gah, and you can find it on our Patreon at patreon.com/EISTPOD. It's there that we share extended conversations and outtakes, plus live shows, episode recaps, and commentaries, and more. Join our crew today and maximize your listening experience. Head to patreon.com/EISTPod and sign up for our exclusive content. That's it for me from this week. Don't forget to follow us on social media or join our Discord channel. There's a link in the show notes to that. We'll be back next week. Enjoy my live Gah discussion with Darren. And with that, let's get underway. We can't get off on Shang-Chi, although it just came out, so I do have an opinion myself. I thought that Shang-Chi was interesting in that I thought it was funny that a character that was literally based on kung fu exploitation films, of the 70s, was then which, is paying homage to those films of the 70s, was transformed in 2021 into a character that is in a film that is essentially paying homage to like the current like crop of Chinese blockbusters. Like it felt very much like
like the 800
Great
or
Wall
like
or a Wandering Earth,
yeah.
type. Yeah, I think they're going to really love that movie in China because it's just this crazy like CGI blockbuster.
I did, but I mean, again, we can't go too deep down the rabbit hole on Shang-Chi. I think my issue with it was that like in terms of publication and in terms of like Marvel history, right? Obviously, Master of Kung Fu is a deeply problematic title in terms of its treatment character. Like you're entirely right. It's kung fu exploitation, clearly coming from a place of love, but written by a bunch of white and Jewish men who like don't necessarily have a position to comment. But it existed as part of a wave of like Marvel Comics titles during the 70s, like say Tomb of Dracula, which gave us Blade, and then Blade gives us the modern comic book movie, or even say Conan the Barbarian, written by Roy Thomas, which like was Marvel Comics like pushing beyond the superhero mold and saying, look, we can put out monthly titles that run for hundreds of issues that aren't like generic superhero cape stuff. And I and again, what I really loved about Blade, Stephen Norrington's Blade and Guillermo del Toro's like Blade 2 when they came out at the turn of the millennium, was that they're like, yeah, it's comic book stuff, but it's not like Superman or Batman or standard superhero stuff. We're not doing Richard Donner, we're not doing Tim Burton. And I think what I reacted a little bit against in Shang-Chi was that this character who was not a conventional superhero in any sense of the word was kind of turned into one.
Yeah, he absolutely was. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it's, it disappointed me because it wasn't what I expected, but I think probably mathematically it's the correct choice because we've got an endless amount of like grim badasses, in the style of the way that Shang-Chi was in the comics early on, the Kwai Chan Kang type character, and making him like fun, relatable, and part of this larger world is the right choice. I just would have liked to have seen a Hong Kong-esque, just like bare bones
$80 million, $80 million if even
$80 million karate film,
no CGI, like obviously with CGI, but like no CGI finale and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, like, and to be fair, like again, this is the thing that when I make these criticisms, I want to be very clear, like. I still find myself immensely moved by even things I don't like, how moved people are by them. Like watching the reaction to Shang-Chi, even if the movie wasn't for me, is deeply moving because I see how much it means to other people. And I'm wary of kind of harshing people's buzz or anything like that. And like, I do think that's important. I do think that matters. But I find that, if you touch on something that people are sensitive about, you discover that, the fan is short for fanatic. And that comes to when you have crazy opinions. I mean, on this podcast, I'm sure you have like Star Trek opinions that have provoked responses, I suspect.
Yeah, certainly.
I'm kind of curious. Do you have one you can throw out there? What's the Star Trek hot take?
I've had early on in the debut of Discovery, I had some kind of strident opinions about it, and I had to learn to differentiate my criticism from the more toxic criticism that we've talked about. I am critical of it, but I don't want to be heard as somebody like that. So that's a lesson I learned. Something else was that like I was very critical of the reboot films earlier around the time of the release of Discovery a couple of years ago, and I had a specific person like seek me out and say, hey man, I don't disagree with you. Why do you crap on the reboot films? I think you've got a lousy attitude. And I took that to, I think I probably lost that person as a listener, but I took that to heart that I still don't like them, but they are some fans' entrance into the franchise, and that person may have gone on and really enjoyed CBS Trek, gone back and enjoyed the original Trek, TNG, so on and so forth. But everybody steps on the train somewhere at some station. That's
it exactly. Like I mean, my like I do like the first two Abrams movies. I think I look at them through a very particular lens. But a lot of my affection for them is tied up in the fact that like I took my partner to see them, and she fell in love with Star Trek through them, and therefore like I find that some of the, and you're right, like a large part of being critical about these things is differentiating yourself from the toxic criticism. I would be like, modern Doctor Who would be a big example for me, where I do not care for the Chibnall era, but I'm also, again, very happy that it means a lot to people, and I'm also take care to differentiate myself from the hashtag not my doctor crowd. There's a lot to unpack there, but I absolutely kind of I see where you're coming from there. I think I would agree entirely.
Well, we'll get to Doctor Who in a little bit. As a columnist,
I like that we have I like that we have a little checklist.
Yeah, that's a little down the line here. What I think is so interesting and so unique about Anno's return to Evangelion is that it's partially, that he's in a better place and he wants to do it right. Although he was quoted at the beginning of the process saying that he wanted to destroy Evangelion, so that's not good. But but it's also that
we should, like, again, for listeners who are not familiar with Evangelion, it is very important to stress, like, the key point of Evangelion from its inception is Hideki Anno, who at that stage was like in his 20s or 30s, looking at these animes that he loved, these kind of mech suit like animes, and going, is it right for a grown man to fixate on anime? And right. The central thesis.
Break these toys.
It's not like he like reached an old age and kind of looked back and got reflective, like, what have I done? From the outset, it was like, wait, is this a cool thing for me to be doing as a grown up? Like the central point of every ending of Neon Genesis Evangelion is maybe the world would be a better place if you went outside and stopped worrying about Neon Genesis Evangelion. To be fair,
right. and the people, the rights owners and everybody, makes billions of dollars, can expect to make billions more dollars if they do these. So it's possible that it's a very cynical undertaking to redo this. And yet, and I resisted it for that reason. I mean, I've had years to come back around to it because it took so damn long for these things to come out. But over the course of the 4 films, he like reorients that idea and brings it back and actually makes them like a companion piece or a commentary on the original series. Like they deepen your experience of the original series. And the character who is like the avatar of the commercialism of the series, like Mari, actually finds a place within the narrative that is enriching and proves that, she's not just something for the fans. Like she's actually, I just think that it's an unbelievable, like 1 in a million, like success.
It absolutely is. And like, I mean, and I again, like one of the small things that I really note and kind of love or hate about it is the fact that, like, if you live in the West, so I'm not going to presume that all your listeners are based in Europe or America, but if you are, I love that there's an entirely different version of Neon Genesis Evangelion depending on whether you've subscribed to Netflix, in which case you get the original series and End of Evangelion, or you subscribe to Amazon, in which case you get the 4 rebuild movies. I think you're right. Like, one of the weird things about the Evangelion, like the rebuild movies, is, first of all, like, I watched them all quite recently because I wanted to watch Thrice Upon a Time. I'd watched the original series, I think, about 10 years ago. But, like, I kind of wanted to watch Thrice Upon a Time when it came out. So I watched the first one, and I felt really disillusioned watching the first one. Because I was like, is it just going to be, like, rewatching the original kind of series? Is it, like... Is it the same experience? And you're right. Like, halfway through, a flip switches, and it's like it becomes this meditation on, like, why on earth are you doing this? Like, there's a moment in the third one where, like, the main character Shinji, and again, like, it's really weird. The rebuild movies are technically shorter than the original movies, but they're somehow like stiller and more full of these weird tangents that are like primarily about how life is great and you should just like live. That's what you should do. You should just focus on being. That's kind of important. Like growing watermelons in the second movie, and in the third movie, maybe you could play piano. That'd be a kind of a cool thing to do. Reading, you should maybe read a little bit. That'll make you a better person. But like, there's a moment in the third one where like the Anno character Shinji like talks about playing piano, and he's like, how do I get better at playing piano? And his partner says, well, look, the point isn't to be good at it, the point is to enjoy it and derive value from it that way. But perhaps you can hone it by practicing through repetition. You do it again and again and again, and eventually you reach a point where you can say, that feels pretty good. And like, you feel almost like Anno is kind of like working through the therapy of it, where it's like, I did a first draft of this, now I'm returning and writing a second draft, and maybe at the end I'll be able to say, that's pretty good. I'm happy with this. Which it's so good. It's again reflective on itself, on the creative process, on like why it exists. Because the movies are asking the same question I think a lot of people watching the movies are, which is why is this? Like, what is the point of this?
Yeah.
What is this exercise accomplishing?
Let's find out together. Yeah. I have a theory about Hideaki Anno, and it's he's the mirror universe George Lucas. So just stick with me. First of all, he's Japanese, which George Lucas would be chuffed to be Japanese, at least young George Lucas would. He starts off under the tutelage of a more famous filmmaker. Coppola is his Miyazaki. Mm-hmm. He works on a commercial flop that's critically praised, so Wings of Anamisi is his THX 1138. He has his career-defining smash with Eva. It's a Star Wars. And, of course, he gets rich off of the merchandising for years on that. Then he returns to his original creation, and this is where the watcher would point out that the universes are diverging. It takes a while to get going, but ultimately the rebuild of Eva is seen as an artistic success, unlike the Star Wars prequels, but they both make money, of course. And his side project is a smash as well, unlike Lucas's. Shin Godzilla is his Red Tails.
And Shin Godzilla is like fundamentally important to the rebuild, to the point where he goes off in the middle of the rebuilds, and like there's a 9-year gap between the third and fourth one because he can't make it work. And he goes off and he's like, I just need to do something to get my mind occupied. And he makes Shin Godzilla, which is a masterpiece. And like, for my money, probably the best Godzilla film since maybe the 1984 version. Was the 1984? Am I thinking the 1984 one? Is that the right year? Or 88?
Yeah, 84. Yeah.
84. Yeah, that's the one.
Or I think so. Yeah.
All right.
Sounds right. Well, I can't wait for Anno's smaller, more personal films. There's been a lot of controversy recently over the future of theaters and the future of film distribution, with theaters being closed because of the pandemic and studios experimenting with day-and-date digital releases. And a lot of the controversy is centered around actors like Scarlett Johansson, who's suing Disney because she feels like she was cheated out of profit participation due to the digital release. But I have to give it to Christopher Nolan, who has also spoken out about first-run digital releases, and not just because he's an old-school cinephile and he thinks people should see films in theaters. He paid all that money for an IMAX camera for a reason, but it's also because it's not just ScarJo or Emily Blunt who's hurt by the current profit system for movies. Many of the below-the-line crew and non-starring actors also receive residuals based on a film's box office performance, and they're getting less money due to the digital distribution as well, at least with the currently negotiated deals. So I have to commend Nolan for that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think like that's the thing where I understand a lot of people being like, look, I like watching movies on streaming. It's incredibly convenient. My parents live in the middle of nowhere. They do not have a cinema near them. They do not have a specialty art house cinema near them. They do not have an IMAX cinema near them. Like, Netflix is a godsend to them. Yeah. And like, I will sit here and I will rave for hours about like the good work that Netflix does, giving like, as absurd as it sounds, but giving people like Martin Scorsese $200 million to make something like The Irishman, which would never, like, it's insane. And if I were a Netflix, like, shareholder, I would, like, ask why. I would ask very serious questions. But as a Netflix consumer, I'm like, yeah, do that. Keep doing that. But also even things like Netflix's support of, like, female and minority filmmakers, its support of first-time filmmakers, like Remy Weeks' His House is phenomenal as well, if you haven't checked it out. Like, Netflix and these streaming services do really good work in like making cinema accessible. And I think like that's the thing when people talk about like being antsy about the future of cinema and like being worried about the shift to streaming. I think that people make it a black and white issue, and it's not really. I think that streaming services do good work. But I also think that when you look at how the major studios have approached streaming in the middle of the pandemic, I think there's a great deal of cynicism required in that, in large part because, as you point out, like profit participation, like it's very easy to look at somebody like Scarlett Johansson and think, don't you have enough money? Or Christopher Nolan think, don't you have enough money? Or Ben Affleck, don't you have enough money? But the issue is it's not those actors who are affected. Or those individuals or celebrities who are affected. Those individuals and celebrities have a platform in which they can like actually take action against it. It's the actors who rely on residual checks for playing like doctors, police officers, medics, bit parts with 2 or 3 lines, who get like money every time a movie or a TV show in which they appear airs on syndication on television, and that simply doesn't happen with the deals that are struck on streaming. And in particular, when a movie goes direct to streaming, it cuts off other revenues as well. So like you're less likely to sell a movie that is available on Disney Plus to television and terrestrial networks, and therefore less likely to pay out the back end in terms of residuals. I mean, like, I listen to, say, the podcast, any podcast with any actor on it, but like I listen to Blank Check with Griffin and David. I think it's one of the best movie podcasts out there. Slight plug for a podcast I'm not involved in, but I think that like you will listen to Griffin Newman, who is he was a series regular on The Tick on Amazon, and I think he was on Party Animals. Like, he's been around forever, but he will still talk about how, like, every once in a while he will receive a check for that episode he did of Blue Bloods, and that will allow him to eat for a month, you know? Nice. And there are these stories about people who played, like, a bad guy in a Law & Order episode, and because Law & Order is always airing somewhere in the world at this moment in time, they get to eat as a result of it being there. Yeah. And I mean, again, maybe it's not a perfect system, maybe there's a replacement to be found, but I think a lot of the argument about the streaming transition is, but you figure that out before you do the transition. Like, you don't shift dramatically and then just say, it'll all work itself out at the end, it'll come out in the wash. You say, no, there needs to be a way to ensure that, like, those actors aren't going to starve, because, like, again, it's a necessary profession. They do good work. And, we are obviously talking about it, acting in the middle of a pandemic that has affected every profession on the planet. And I will happily have the discussion about, every other profession on the planet. But I know about film discussion, so I'm talking about film, if that makes sense.
And Hollywood always has to be reminded of that oops, you owe us money. The same thing happened with streaming shows when TV shows started streaming on the internet, and writers are writing content for the internet, and they weren't getting paid for things on the digital side, and so
that was a large part of the writers' strike, wasn't it? If I remember correctly, that was a large part of the old 2008 writers' strike as well. If I remember correctly, was it 2008? Yeah. But like, and again, it's not even just that. It's like, I mean, it's take it beyond that. Like, Hollywood has anybody who's familiar with the history of Hollywood understands the term Hollywood accountant. Yeah, that's it exactly. Yeah. So like Forrest Gump, right? Which is one of the biggest, you know where this story is going, one of the biggest movies of all time. But they had an agreement with the writer that he would take something like 10% of the profits off it. So as a result, Hollywood math has proved that Forrest Gump has never turned a profit ever, despite some, like, being, I think at the time of release, the 5th biggest movie of all time at the box office. Which is absolutely insane. And so you look at things like look at Quibi, for example. And I want to be very careful when I talk about Quibi, because Jeffrey Katzenberg's a very litigious individual, and I'm sure he listens to this podcast.
Well, obviously.
A big fan. It's just kind of playing on the air in the background. But I think that, like, Quibi was one of those things. For those who are not aware, Quibi is Quick Bites. It is now, I believe, available on Roku's streaming service, their entire back catalog. But the idea was that, as it was pitched by the people who invested in it, particularly Jeffrey Katzenberg, best known for his work at Disney and DreamWorks, the idea was that you would watch these things on your phone, and they would all be very short. They'd be about 7 minutes of content, because people want quick bites of information. That's the future. It's like your grandpa looked at TikTok and said, yeah, Netflix, but that. And I remember when I heard the idea, part of my brain was just like, this has to be some sort of tax scam. This just sounds like it's the kind of thing that you read in, like, chapter 1 of a book, and then in chapter 2 it's like, oh yeah, it turned out it was an elaborate pyramid scheme. And it turns out, I believe, and again, I will send through notes so you can include them in the show notes so that, like, nobody can get litigious over this. But I believe it was discovered that the issue with the 7-minute time limit was that, I think in the state where they were filming, or the state where they were kind of based, 7 minutes is what would make it a movie and would make them have to pay residuals. So keeping everything under 7 minutes meant that technically what they were producing was not a feature film, and so there was not profit sharing attached. And you're like, yep, that is the way around it. Like,
how to wash $2 billion. Wow.
Yeah.
It's just
so cynical. I know.
Yeah, that's just, and of course, like, the think pieces come in by the thousands about Quibi and whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, but, like, that simple fact is just kind of chilling.
Yeah, well, I will, again, we may prepare to cut that for the lawyers, but I will find the show notes.
This is all in Minecraft.
Yeah. But I will find that and send that through, so it will be in there so people can verify it, just because I'm wary.
Let's talk about something else depressing. Last time you were on the program, we talked about the current state of Doctor Who and your then recent article on the topic, and since then it's been announced that both series star Jodie Whittaker and series lead producer Chris Chibnall will be departing after one more season. And you've got another article about that, and you emphasize in the article that this hasn't really happened, specifically both the lead actor and the head writer spots being open at the same time. Do you think that a fresh start will be a cure for the perceived ills that the series has experienced recently?
Well, no, actually, to be fair, every transition has been an actor and a doctor leaving. So it was Russell T Davies and David Tennant leaving, and it was Stephen Moffat and Peter Capaldi leaving at the same time.
That's true.
It's more that like this is the first time that you have a showrunner leaving after a single doctor. So Davies had Christopher Eccleston and David Tennant,
for two,
and obviously Moffat had Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi, and as a result, then you get a difference between the actor and the showrunner creator, and that like Eccleston's season is utterly unlike is very different from Tennant's that follow. Matt Smith's era is very different from Peter Capaldi's that follows. They're kind of night and day, and you can see a progression, and you can kind of identify like the difference between the Doctor and the showrunner. I think the issue for me with the 13th Doctor and the departure of both Whittaker and Chibnall is the fact that you end up with a Doctor and showrunner who are so inexorably linked in the mind and in the kind of world of the show. And so you have this weird situation where, like, I am very happy that there are people who enjoy Whittaker. I'm really happy that there are people who will look at this version of the show and say this is their version of Doctor Who. I'm really glad, as you point out, that there are people who are going to get on the train here, and like this is the part of the show that introduces them to like Doctor Who and what it can be. Yeah. But I have found myself, unfortunately, consistently disappointed with the show, and largely frustrated by the writer and showrunner, Chris Chibnall. And to be fair, to give credit where credit is due, because I always worry that I sound incredibly cynical and incredibly negative and incredibly soul-destroying, I think Chibnall does deserve credit as a producer in terms of logistics. I think that, like, as somebody managing the day-to-day production of the show, I think Chibnall has arguably done as good a job as any of his predecessors, in that when Davies took over Doctor Who, it was famously such a panic production that that Eccleston walked off after the first season. Yeah. Because like the show was chaos behind the scenes. Moffat very famously had to split the show in order to get it out. He had difficulty scheduling. You had production kind of running over budget. You had famous disagreements happening behind the scenes with the line producers and stuff like that. And I think Chibnall, to his credit, perhaps because he comes off shows like, say, Law and Order UK, for example, or shows like Broadchurch at ITV, where those are the private sector and they've got a much stronger sense of, they've got a kind of a more global sense of kind of production than arguably some of the BBC stuff. You have Chibnall coming off those and kind of applying a logistical producer's eye to it. So things like, I know that, for example, Davies did second unit shooting in New York and obviously took the show to Dubai for the specials. I know that Moffat did a lot of shooting in Monument Valley in Utah and obviously took the show to New York and obviously then took the show to, I believe, Mallorca and Spain in kind of later seasons. But I don't think anybody used locations as well as Chibnall in terms of giving the show production scale and value. So like going to South Africa to shoot, say, the Ghost Monument and to shoot Rosa. I think in terms of things like small choices like the anamorphic lenses, which make the show look a lot more conventionally cinematic and update the visual style, which I think is commendable. It makes it look more like modern prestige television. Things like the shift behind the scenes. I know that a lot of people are maybe not overly fond of the music of the Chibnall era, but I do think that sort of shift is good in that like it makes the show his own. And I do think, to give one more note of praise before I start laying into him as a producer, I do think it's important to note that Chibnall as a producer and a day-to-day operation of the show has taken great care to make sure that his cast are taken care of in terms of logistically managing the workload of those involved. That is particularly important in terms of Whittaker, who has a young family. Also in terms of Bradley Walsh, who's appeared in the previous two seasons and like has an entire side hustle as a game show host in the United Kingdom and didn't have to give that up to be on Doctor Who. And whereas you look at, say, the previous seasons and you have, like, again, I mentioned Eccleston, like, apparently, according to his friend, as it Alan Davis, like was on the verge of nervous collapse after shooting 13 episodes because the pacing was that frantic.
Yeah.
The 3 doctors prior to Whittaker have all required back or knee surgery. In large part due to the strain on the role. Like Tennant had to take time off during Hamlet, I think, to get back surgery. I believe Smith and Capaldi both had to get similar knee surgery as well, because it's a role that is tremendously strenuous physically, and particularly when you're on a show like that. And to Chibnall's credit, I am not aware of anybody on the production needing that sort of surgery. It's also clear when you watch the episodes that his decision to feature a larger primary cast, shifting away from the classic doctor and companion dynamic of the previous, sort of like 4 doctors. I know that you occasionally had like guest stars, or it's like second companions, like say Jack or Nardole, but generally speaking, it's male doctor, female companion for the bulk of the run. With Chibnall, you have a doctor and 3 companions. This allows him to basically to ensure that every member of the cast gets time off, that the production schedule is not too draining on any of them because they split time across episodes. So he can split up the cast, and it means that Whittaker only has to shoot 4 or 5 days as opposed to having to shoot a full 10. And I think that's commendable. I think like the making Doctor Who shouldn't require surgery for an actor. I feel like that's a bare, it should not just, like that should be a bare minimum threshold. And I think Chibnall deserves credit for having figured that out. And I think that like that is genuinely commendable. But I do also think that, like, as a storyteller, I have not connected with his Doctor Who at all. I feel like it lacks a strong, distinctive voice. I feel like it lacks a strong, distinctive vision. I feel like he doesn't necessarily understand what the appeal of the show was in its earlier incarnations. And more than that, I don't think he understands what he wants the appeal of his version of the show to be. I mean, again, I don't know how deep we want to get into the weeds on this. Darren says like 10 minutes into a rant on Doctor Who. But like you have things like, say, okay, to pick a very concrete and very specific example. At the end of Davies' first season of Doctor Who, the one starring Christopher Eccleston, which is, for my money, one of the best seasons Doctor Who ever produced, you have a 2-part episode, and it's a 2-part big season finale. And the first part of that is called Bad Wolf. And what is notable about Bad Wolf is that it is basically Doctor Who collapses into reality television. You have the characters abducted to the game station where they are cycled through a series of recognizable British television shows. And those include like What Not to Wear with Trini and Susanna, like The Weakest Link with the android, and obviously Big Brother. And like it's very clear watching this that that Davies, who is like a wonderful man who has a great deal of affection for like British television and like the history of British television and pop television in particular, is like, yeah, look at this. The key point here is that Doctor Who is part of this television landscape. It's like Doctor Who deserves to be in conversation with The Weakest Link. It deserves to be
the
in
BBC cinematic universe.
Yeah. But more than that, like the Big Brother is Channel 4. He managed to convince Channel 4 to let him do Big Brother, to bring over like the iconography because everybody loves it so much, which is great. Sure. And like that's great. That is for my money like what Doctor Who should be. And then you look at, say, the recent season of Chibnall's Doctor Who, which has a similar structure. It builds to a big epic 2-part finale. And the first part of the 2-part finale is constantly interrupted by flashbacks to the story of an Irish police officer living, I think, in the 1920s or 30s. And you look at that and it looks like it's shot like kind of BBC or ITV period dramas. It looks like the kind of dramas that are on British television on Sunday evenings opposite Doctor Who. So we're talking about things like Heartbeat, for example. We're talking about things like Call the Midwife, that sort of stuff. These quaint, nostalgic kind of dramas. And there's none of the sense of love or celebration that you got in that kind of Eccleston episode. Instead, the show is structured so that every time you cut to this stuff, the show is going, yeah, but look, this is the boring stuff that's happening on other TV channels. Don't you want like cool Cybermen stuff and explosions and chases and all this sort of stuff? And it feels much more antagonistic to the idea of Doctor Who in the television landscape, where Davies was like, Doctor Who is part of the television landscape. It's folded in. It clearly loves it. Chibnall seems to be, but Doctor Who is better than this other TV stuff that you could be watching. Why are you watching Heartbeat or Call the Midwife when you could be watching Cybermen?
Interestingly antagonistic to other things on TV.
It is like that. And like that's the thing, is that it doesn't feel like it exists in conversation. It feels like it exists in a vacuum, and I find myself struggling with that. And I think the article that you mentioned, the big argument there was about Whittaker, because I like Whittaker as a performer. I think there is a solid argument, like in a vacuum, if you have not seen any of like her version of the show, that Whittaker is one of the best actors to have ever played the role of the Doctor. Like if you put all the actors' CVs down and you go, which of these is the strongest actor to have ever played the role? It's like Eccleston, Capaldi, and her. Like they're the actors with the strongest body of work coming into the role. And I feel like she has been done a disservice because the material is frankly not great. And you have this thing where the writers have no idea what makes her version of the character different from any earlier iteration. Like I can tell you, and again, I don't know how nerdy you are in terms of getting into the weeds of Doctor Who, but I can tell you the difference between Patrick Troughton and John Pertwee. I can tell you the difference between Tom Baker and Colin Baker. I can tell you the difference between Peter Davison and Sylvester McCoy. I can tell you the difference between all these different versions or iterations of the character over the show's 50-year history. But then you get to Whittaker's version of the character, and it's like, I don't know what makes this version of the character that much different from David Tennant's or Matt Smith's. Which is difficult because they're very distinct from each other. But it feels very much like Whittaker is being written like she's some sort of amalgam of the memory of those two. And so I'm wondering if we're going to see a rehabilitation of the character in kind of like in spin-off media, like happened with Colin Baker, the famously troubled Sixth Doctor from the 80s.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I mean, we don't know if it's come. I don't know what the odds are on Patty Power or whatever. But do you think the Doctor will be coming back immediately, or do you think that it will rest for a while?
I mean, like they have kind of suggested that there's going to be a revolutionary change. Now, to be fair, that's just standard marketing. Whenever you want a change to happen, you're like, yeah, it's going to be a big change because you want people to tune in and pay attention to it. Yeah. It happened with the transition from Davies to Moffat, where it's like, oh my God, David Tennant's leaving. It's the end of an era, so tune in and see what happens next. And it happened with like Capaldi to Whittaker, where it's like, oh my God, it's finally there's going to be a female Doctor. It's radical change. So I think I suspect the BBC, it will come back. The question is, like, who is going to showrun it? And there's a lot of debate and discussion about that. Like, I'm less interested in who the next Doctor is going to be, because I generally trust that they will hire somebody who is basically competent to play the role.
They'll be talented. Sure.
It's a nice role in British television. It probably pays relatively well. You do it for a couple of years, and it's a nice thing on your CV. And it also means that you can then rely on ancillary kind of income streams afterwards if you want to do tie-ins or if you want to do fan conventions. But you're not beholden to it forever. And plus you have people like Eccleston, Tennant, and Capaldi, who are massively respected actors who have put in their time. So there's no longer the stigma of, I'm doing this weird little science fiction show that maybe you had before then. So I'm more interested in the showrunner. I'm wondering who the showrunner is going to be. Who's the next? Because there's no real heir apparent in terms of the show. Because obviously during the Davies era, it was Moffat. It was always going to be Moffat because Moffat wrote the best reviewed episodes. Yeah. Moffat was the writer who Davies did not rewrite. Davies actually made a statement of saying Davies has talked about how he would throw out the drafts that writers gave him and do a page one rewrite himself. And if you want to read a book on TV writing, Davies, The Writer's Tale is one of the most honest and frank kind of discussions I've ever seen of a showrunner talking about the mechanics of their job and how they do what they do. And he's talked about how he would feel really frustrated when he was watching reaction to the show and people would be like, Davies writes the weakest episodes of Doctor Who and we love this other episode. And he'd talk about how, if you knew how much of that other episode I wrote,
was mine.
I didn't put the name on because you don't do that because that's rude and terrible. But I did write a lot of that episode that you love. And then you had during the Moffat era, you had Chibnall who had been writing. He'd written under Davies, he'd written under Moffat, he'd showrun Torchwood, he'd gone off and he'd done Law and Order UK, he'd done Broadchurch. It was always going to be Chibnall or Toby Whitehouse was the other contender, but Chibnall seemed to be the favourite. Whereas I don't see like a comparable figure within the franchise at this moment in time, which is interesting. Does it mean we're going to get an outsider? Does it mean we're going to get a Fred Freeberger coming in and taking charge of Doctor Who? To not to offer too strong a bridge back to what we're going to be talking about in a moment.
I don't know enough about British TV to posit a guess. The only personage I know who hasn't been brought up is Mark Gatiss, who I think at this point has moved on to other pastures, but. I know that they had floated the idea. This is just a fan theory, but somebody said, "Hey, J. Michael Straczynski should do it. He's a guy that can manage a long running franchise."
I think Straczynski floated that idea himself, which I do.
Oh, is
admire.
that he did it? Okay.
I kind of admire the gumption. Yeah, like I know that this is a British TV show, but I'm just saying my number's right here. Give me a call.
Sure.
Who would I get in touch with about this? I think was what he said to Twitter.
Yeah.
Which is great because I kind of love the idea of some poor BBC receptionist having to pick up the phone to J. Michael Straczynski and have to try and put him through to the Director General of the BBC. But part of me wonders would the thing to do be to bring in somebody who isn't necessarily sci-fi heavy or Doctor Who heavy or a big fan of Doctor Who, somebody who is instead kind of associated with just BBC drama in general, and kind of seeing them kind of work that way, like say Michael Piller on Star Trek The Next Generation, where you have a producer who is at the time, now to be fair, Piller coming into The Next Generation is a very particular set of circumstances, but it's he's not a huge Star Trek fan, and it's oh, by the way, you're going to be shepherding this franchise for the next decade, so tuck in and get comfortable. But I do kind of my personal dream horse pick, which will never happen and probably should never happen, to be clear, which is always a great way to introduce your kind of dream horse pick, would be Neil Cross, the guy who did Luther. Because he's run Luther, which is, again, show running, so he has the experience. He's worked at the BBC. He's written scripts for Doctor Who in the past. In particular, I think his episode Hyde from the 50th anniversary season is an underrated masterpiece. He did also write The Rings of Akaton, which is a somewhat ropier script. Yeah, there we go. But that was, I believe, a last-minute substitute in his defense. That was a script that apparently came. He wrote Hyde. Hyde was great, and they're we had a slight problem. Would you like to write a second script very quickly? And he's yeah, sure, why not? But he was also attached to do, he's responsible for one of my, those TV shows that never happen, but you're I really wish that had happened. Yeah. Where he was supposed to do a reboot of Sapphire and Steel for ITV, kind of the classic, I think it was 60s or 70s, I think maybe 70s, ITV sci-fi kind of weird answer to Doctor Who. And part of me is I would love to see him just port that idea over and do Doctor Who, even though it would probably be insane and likely highly controversial and probably lead to lots of those arguments online that we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, right. Exactly. At this point in the existence of Star Trek, in season 3 of the original series, it's seen by its corporate parent Paramount as an expensive show with low ratings. So regardless of its creative exhaustion or possible creative renewal, it's for the chopping block. Now, however, the merchandising and franchise potential of every property is considered by its owner, considered perhaps chiefly by its owner. So franchises like Doctor Who and perhaps Star Trek will be continued way past their creative heights or their relevance. And Star Trek on CBS, in my opinion, seems to be poised to go either way. I feel personally that, Discovery has had 3 years to make a statement about its place in sci-fi and what it wants to say, and it's really only made a relatively general statement about, positive social ideals. Picard seems to me to be a almost completely unnecessary rehash of the franchise's best character, and Lower Decks is literally cannibalizing the franchise's history. So now we're poised to see another spacefaring series in Prodigy, a look at the darker side of Trek in Section 31. Trek seems to be able to continue to innovate, but does it have anything to say about the time in which it's made or about the future?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing where I don't want to seem overly negative or overly cynical or overly pessimistic, but I kind of one of the things that I like about Star Trek Into Darkness, and I know it's a controversial, divisive movie, is that it is a political commentary. Now, again, the argument about whether or not that's tied up in Kurtzman's politics is a conversation for another time. But
I don't even know Kurtzman's politics. I've watched so much of that.
No, sorry, it's Orsi. Apologies. It's Orsi's politics. Sorry, wrong contributor. But like, but however much it might be tied up in those particulars, it is a movie that is about like drone warfare. It is a movie that is about the war on terror. It's a movie about how angry America was in response to this terrible thing that had happened, and how they were looking to blame somebody for that and to retaliate against it. And like, however you feel about it, and however you might feel about it being a blockbuster movie and its plot holes and all that sort of stuff, I do feel like that had something to say. And I do think that, like, if you look at the first season of Discovery, I think that, the finale is not good. But I do think that the first season has interesting things to say about where America is at, like, in 2017 and what that feels like, and the better angels of our nature and so on and so forth. But I will admit that, like, since then, I find myself kind of disconnected, where the thing that Star Trek largely seems to be saying in its current incarnation, and to be fair, it is not a problem unique to Star Trek, and I don't want to pretend that it is. It's something that I would say is arguably true of, like, the rise of Skywalker, and probably true, if we're being honest, about... I mentioned Chris Chibnall's Doctor Who and having difficulty discerning, like, a vision or a statement behind it. I think it is saying the same thing. And what it is saying is, this is Star Trek, or this is Star Wars, or this is Doctor Who. That is kind of what it seems to be reiterating over and over again, is this idea of it is a brand extension or a continuation. It is a valid piece of media tied to this franchise. It is something... It is again, I hate the word content as it's used in this context. Again, it felt like content was used ironically up until it wasn't, which is one of those bleak words. The contentification of kind of media. And I mean, and it's not even just Star Trek and stuff like that. Like, who really wanted Dax Shepard's Chips movie, for example? Do I really want Monsters at Work on Disney Plus? Do I really want Doug Days, although it's nice to have a bit more Ed Asner in my life, all that sort of stuff. But it's the idea of, like, taking these things, and again, this is the thing where I don't want to seem like overly romantic or nostalgic. We should be clear, there has always been this aspect of it. As you pointed out, like, the idea of, like, brand management. Is there in truth no beauty? The IDEC, infinite diversity and infinite combinations. Arguably the purest distillation of the Star Trek philosophy, the most humanist statement in the history of the franchise, the essence by which many people who would gauge the franchise to be utopian would measure it, was effectively a mechanism for Gene Roddenberry to sell a hood ornament through Lincoln Enterprises. Yes. It's a fascinating story. And again, it's one of those situations where you really get a sense of Freeburger being caught in the middle, because it's like Nimoy refused to read the lines and called Fred Freeburger. Fred Freeburger did nothing. You have this idea of Roddenberry using the franchise's humanism to, like, sell a toy through the mail and make some money himself. So, like, commerce has always been part of this sort of thing. But I do find myself, as time goes on, increasingly skeptical about the extent to which that is naked and the extent to which that is all of the content. That is the sum total of what this is. Because it's the thing with Discovery, which, and again, I know people like it, and I know people find value in it, I know people enjoy it, and I think there are really great things to celebrate about Discovery. I think, like, its incorporation of, like, gay and transgender and non-binary actors and characters is commendable, and something that is righting a mistake that the franchise kind of continued to make, through the 90s and into the 2000s. And I think that's worth celebrating. But I also, when I watch the show, I kind of groan inwardly every time the characters repeat the three words, "We are Starfleet." Yeah. Because it feels like the show is saying, this is Star Trek. It feels like it's saying, it's just reiterating to you, the audience, that this is part of the larger franchise Star Trek and an extension of the property that is Star Trek, and you are consuming Star Trek.
Maybe it's like public radio, where they have to identify, like, every 15 minutes on the hour.
Yeah, but without any understanding of, like, what Starfleet is, without any potentially, like, hugely controversial statements about what Starfleet stands for. Like, I look at things like, I look at things like, say, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and I look at things like, say, Chimera. And Chimera as an episode of Star Trek is fascinating in large part because it seems like Ira Stephen Bear holding the franchise's feet to the fire over their refusal to feature gay or transgender or non-binary characters. Because Chimera is an episode in which a bunch of Starfleet officers feel really uncomfortable at Odo holding hands with another man in public.
Yes.
That's essentially what Chimera is. In case you don't get the subtext.
Pride parade on the promenade.
Yeah, that's it exactly. And you have O'Brien saying, "Look, I don't mind, but do they have to do it in public?" In case you don't get the subtext of what's going on here.
Yes.
O'Brien as every middle-aged Irish person's dad. But that's the kind of statement that feels like a statement about the franchise that is worth making, because it's a statement that's like, yeah, we've made mistakes in the past, or we're continuing to make them in the present in that case, and we need to do better, and we've thought about the history and we've thought about their place. Whereas just saying we are Starfleet doesn't say anything. It doesn't mean anything, because Starfleet doesn't exist. Starfleet is a concept and a construct, and it can represent anything to anybody. Yeah. Saying we are Starfleet, is the opposite of Chimera. It's saying, oh no, the franchise, Star Trek is Star Trek. When the story of David Livingston running down to the set to stop two same-sex actors holding hands on the set of The Offspring, that is Starfleet. And it's you should be calling that out and engaging with it. And that's my thing. That's kind of my big problem with the modern age of kind of franchise management. I feel like I'm the old man now. I feel like I'm the greatest generation guy writing Star Trek the original series, not understanding the kids. But I feel like so much of modern franchise management is nothing more than asserting brand recognition. And you mentioned it with Lower Decks, and I don't hate Lower Decks, and I the irony with Lower Decks is that Lower Decks seems like it is the Star Trek show for people who do not care for Discovery or Picard, who think that the newfangled action sequences are too much and just want Star Trek The Next Generation. But it's also, as you pointed out, just a greatest hits kind of machine.
It's consumed by just about everybody. And recently, I've really been struggling with the idea that it's so reference heavy, and it's supposedly, for the hardcore Star Trek fan. But I bet hardcore Star Trek fans are either not watching it or hate watching it. And all of the references that they're making, and I'm not casting aspersions on any type of Star Trek fan, but all the original series and early TNG references they're making are probably lost on an entire generation that grew up watching Voyager and possibly DS9. Do they even get some of the references? Who is it for?
Yeah. I mean, I think and this is the thing with Lower Decks, because again, I don't want to sound too harsh, but I think if you put a gun to my head and you said, Darren, what is your favorite episode of Lower Decks? It is the episode towards, I think it's the penultimate episode of the first season. It's the one in the holodeck. It's the one where they do the spoofing of the Star Trek movies, where the entire premise is it's a holodeck episode, and the holodeck is basically doing Star Trek as it was in the movies. Because that's not just a reference to the movies. It's a criticism of the movies. Because the central point of it is that the movies, in order to be commercial and saleable to mass audiences, have to be blockbuster action set pieces with very little internal logic that have absurd, gratuitous wastes of budget that are completely unjustifiable within the confines of a weekly television show. And so, the show is actually making a point. It's not just pointing at, Riker and saying Star Trek, or pointing at Tom Paris and saying Star Trek, or pointing at Bolian and saying Star Trek. It's saying, this is a very weird part of the franchise, and we need to talk about how weird it is, and we need to talk about the relationship between this and the larger franchise in a way that actually says something substantive about it. And I think if Lower Decks was, more of that, if like my dream Lower Decks episode, because like the basic premise of, sorry, this is a tangent upon a tangent, and I apologize for this, but like the basic premise of Lower Decks is we're going to take a Star Trek trope and we're going to remix it. So we're going to do like an episode about trials, because every Star Trek show has a trial episode. We're talking about things like Tribunal, we're talking about things like Judgment, we're talking about any number of examples. I mean, hell, you could even go to like Ex Post Facto. You could jump back to like Gene Roddenberry's weird obsession with sticking trials in the middle of episodes, like with the Menagerie, and like Turnabout Intruder stops to become a trial episode halfway through.
Yes,
but
it does.
But like it's like, hey, you remember that episode? Like we're gonna do a spoof of that, or like the episode where there's a ritualized combat, or the episode where it's like, oh, the crew get turned into monsters, like Macrocosm or Genesis or what have you. Mm-hmm. And a large part of it's just like, hey, you remember this thing, right? And I would feel better if it's like, hey, you remember this thing and we need to talk about it. So I would love to see my dream Lower Decks episode would be like a Prime Directive episode. Would be an episode that's like riffing off episodes like Pen Pals or Homeward or Dear Doctor, but like pointing out how absurd like some of the weird moral dilemmas the characters are being forced into are. Like something that's spoofing like a Private Little War and making the point that maybe the real tragedy here isn't that Kirk feels really bad about it afterwards. I feel like if you're gonna do that, then like commit to it and actually interrogate the tropes that you're doing, rather than just repeating them and reiterating them and kind of hoping to hit the franchise kind of dopamine receptors by saying, oh, I recognize that thing.
Yeah, but I don't think that they think that the franchise can take that. It's like the Christmas party where you tell jokes about the boss, but they're all really toothless jokes. Yeah. And like for the people who just say, because the great a majority of the argument for this stuff is that, hey, it's more Star Trek. And I totally see and accept that argument. And I watch it because it is more Star Trek. But on an axis of completely cynically commercial and we're really trying to say something here, I don't know where we fall. I just sort of default to the middle of that axis.
Yeah, I mean, and again, like I'm cognizant of being the old man shaking my fist at the sky, and I'm also like cognizant of being overly romantic about the franchise's history. I mean, I would argue there are large swaths of, say, Star Trek Voyager that suffer from the same problem. Oh, yeah. And like particularly, say, the 7th season, which is run by I think Kenneth Biller, where like you could really like the 7th season of Voyager feels a lot like modern Star Trek, where it's like, oh, Star Trek says things about the world, but we're not sure what we're saying, so just like make it look like we're saying something. So you have like Critical Care, which is meant to be their take on HMOs, but instead of being like, maybe health insurance is good, it's like, yeah, but what if a doctor was evil? And it's like, no, that's not the metaphor here. That's not what we're doing. That's not the point you're trying to make. Yeah. And like there's a lot of that in there, and I kind of like I'm hesitant to say that like modern Star Trek is just that, and I'm hesitant to say that it is just a problem with modern Star Trek. But I do kind of like I have that kind of problem, and I do think like there are moments when it comes close. Like I think I like Picard a bit more than you do, because like I look at it and I kind of see a show that is on the cusp of a franchise that is on a cusp of like a realization very similar to The Last Jedi was for Star Wars, which is like maybe it's time to like hand over to the next generation, as it were, to hand over to the kids, except the show just pulls back from that at the last possible minute and has Grandpa show up and offer a stern lecture to the kids and make sure that they all know what they're doing right.
Which is classic Star Trek.
Yeah, puts them in a it's very third season TOS. It's like for better and for worse. Like so that's the reason why I'm not quite I'm not entirely cynical about it, because I'm like, these flaws have always been there. I just kind of I wish that there were more of the stuff that I kind of loved about earlier Star Trek. Yeah. I don't think the flaws are all new, but I kind of just wish that there was more of something like, and again, That Which Survives is a very odd episode for me to champion, because it's like I'm not pretending it's a masterpiece, but it's like things that you can really dig into there. And again, I do really like the first season of Discovery. But I kind of with CBS Star Trek, that's my problem. That's been my barrier, is that it's like it comes close to this stuff and then it just pulls away, or it does what the second season does, which is it just turns into people saying we are Star Trek for 13 straight episodes. And like this, and again, I don't want to seem mean or harsh, but can you tell me like what the second season of Star Trek Discovery is about, not in terms of plot. In terms of
family.
like theme, like what does it mean? Yeah, okay, so it's like it's how you don't got friends, you got family.
Yeah, right. That's pretty much all I could think of. And also making sacrifice.
Yeah.
Burnham's mother sacrifices for her. The crew of Discovery sacrifices themselves, to save the present, their present. That's all I can really come up with.
But I look at things like, say, and again, and sorry, this is turning into a very specific discussion, but like within the second season, things like Control, right? Control is recognizable as a classic Star Trek trope. It's a machine run amok. It's an inhuman system. You can point to any number of examples from Star Trek history of that trope in effect. So you can point to things like the Ultimate Computer. You can point to things like the Changeling. You can even jump forward to the Borg if you want. But in each of those cases, I can point to and I can say that they represent particular things along an axis. So things like the Ultimate Computer is the fear of automation and mechanization. It's the fear that men like Kirk, blue-collar space truckers, are going to find themselves like out of work as a result of like innovations that are happening in this era of computers, like in the 1960s. Things like the Borg, they're depending on how you look at it, they're either a metaphor for the fear of communism in this idea of kind of the erosion of self-identity, or they're a dark mirror to the Federation and the idea of assimilation, the idea of all cultures becoming America as America becomes the sole global superpower. Both of those readings are, I would argue, valid and interesting in their own rights, and the franchise kind of plays with both of them across its history in ways that are interesting. But they are meanings, and they are things that exist beyond recognizable Star Trek signifiers. But I look at Control, and I like it's not social media. It's not Elon Musk. It's not Tesla. It's not Jeff Bezos' Amazon. It's not. I can't map it outside of it's a thing that happens in science fiction, if that makes sense.
I think that's what it is. It's a trope that happens in science fiction because this is a science fiction show. Yeah,
and again, sorry, I'm turning into Fred Freeberger or Gene Hackun or Gene Roddenberry.
That was my goal.
Yeah, but like that if I were to like put a pin in it and say that's my issue with, and again, not just Star Trek, not specifically Star Trek. It's happening in Star Wars as well. Like in Star Wars, you can look at The Last Jedi, and The Last Jedi is this discussion between boomers and millennials about who controls the future and like what boomers have done to the world and what they owe to younger generations, and that means something. But you look at Rise of Skywalker, and it's like, hey, Lando's pretty cool, isn't he? The Emperor's back. That's kind of bad, right? And like you look at things like Doctor Who, and it's like you have these kind of big things where the Doctor is dealing with Peter Capaldi's dealing with like hyper capitalism and racism, and then you jump to Jodie Whittaker, and it's like racism is bad, but thank goodness it's a thing that only really happened in the past.
Yeah, we have to make Amazon just treat its workers a little bit better. Yeah,
unpaid
minimum
leave, right?
Galactic wage for everybody. Yeah.
Yeah, like that's the kind of thing that I do find missing in most modern franchise kind of brand extensions, and I feel sad that that's how I talk about them. And I say that as somebody who like does occasionally love this sort of stuff, who again loved that first season of Star Trek Discovery, who quite enjoyed the J.J. Abrams Star Trek movies, who has grown to love The Last Jedi. So I'm not like who loved the Suicide Squad, which is a big franchise installment that came out this year. So I'm not. Yeah. I hope I'm not coming across as a cranky old man complaining about kids these days with their rock and roll and their hip hop.
And their TikToks.
And their TikToks and their Quibbies.
And their Quibbies. Or maybe not anymore.
No.
BackTrekking is back for an all-new season. Hi, I'm Caliban.
And I'm Gooey Fame.
And we'd like to introduce you to BackTrekking, the podcast that explores the real-world inspirations behind your favorite episodes of Star Trek.
From historical events to classical literature to blockbuster films, we go where no pod has gone before to seek out the origins of classic Trek tales.
Did you know, Gooey, that the TNG episode Too Short a Season was an allegory for the Iran-Contra affair?
Yeah, only sweatier. Did you know that the Enterprise episode Regeneration was an homage to the John Carpenter film The Thing?
Archer and T'Pol freezing to death over a bottle of whiskey would have been a controversial ending.
As a dog lover, Archer would not like The Thing, I'm guessing.
Oh my god, movie night is cancelled. Join us every other Thursday for a journey back to the beginnings of the Trek universe.
BackTrekking is available wherever you get your podcasts.
No, Porthos!